Welcome to Legacy Builders, strategies for building successful family enterprises. Brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. I'm your host, Corey Gagnon, Senior Wealth Advisor, and on this show, we explore global ideas, concepts, and models that help family enterprises better navigate the complexities of family wealth. Today, we welcome Judi Cunningham, founder of the consulting firm Trella Advisory Group. With over 25 years' experience navigating the complex dynamics of family enterprises, Judi excels at guiding business families towards alignment and progress. As a thought leader in the field, Judi continues advancing the understanding of family enterprise complexities as the chair of the board of the Purposeful Planning Institute. Harnessing her sharp strategic vision and innovative educational initiatives, her pioneer work has set global standards for advisors serving families of wealth across generations. My goal is to be the most curious person in today's conversation with Judi Cunningham, where we explore building family resilience when faced with adversity during strategic planning. Judi emphasizes delicately understanding individuals' differing perspectives on adversity and managing it with care. We'll highlight facilitating open dialogue by encouraging questions rather than assumptions, giving family members agency to opt into conversations, assess what's important, and say no to get clearer yeses. We'll also explore how transforming unproductive communication into constructive dialogue gradually bears positive results for family enterprises. Now, let's dive in. Welcome, Judi. We're excited to have you here today to share your wealth and knowledge and experiences. Let's dive in, shall we?
Sure. Sounds good.
All right. Judi, imagine you're delivering a commencement speech to the graduating class of 2024, and you have the chance to inspire them with your story. How would you begin your speech to convey the incredible lessons and experiences that you've gained along your career?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think, Corey, I would start by saying something like, the best of life is not in the planning, that it's all the opportunities that present themselves along the way, which is where the richness of life actually exists. And I think that, when I was younger, I used to think that if I planned everything, if I was organized, if I had goals, if I, had everything mapped out, that was going to create the quality of my life. And is that important? Yes, I think it is important. Like, it's important to know where you're going and to have goals and to have direction and all those things. However, I think sometimes there's this kind of obsession or focus on planning to exclusion of everything else. And when I think about my own experiences, my own life, my career, it's really been in the opportunities that have presented themselves along the way that I could have easily ignored because they weren't on the plan, they weren't taking me where I thought I wanted to go. But when I said yes to those things, they opened up a whole new opportunity. And I just think that's so important. And even things that have happened in my life, I was just listening to something yesterday about, sometimes it's the adversity that has us change direction. And so things that I might have said in my life, oh, that was a failure. When I look back on it, it created a new trajectory for my life that completely changed how I think and changed what I'm doing. And so it's, I think about those times now as a real gift, as opposed to, oh, they have kind of some negative experience behind them, right? So I think I would want to impart something like that if I was doing a commencement speech. And I think it's hard when you're young, you just, everything's in front of you and you just think, okay, I want to plan it all. I want to go after it, right? So.
Right. Still focusing on the planning, but having the room for the opportunities, what I'm hearing you say.
Yes.
And how has that shaped the work that you do with families?
Well, it's actually really I think, important because I think one of the things when we work with families, it's really easy to get focused. Like even a family will come in and they'll say, we're going through transition, or we want to transition wealth, or we want to get the next generation educated, or whatever the goals are that they have. You have to pay attention to that. You can't ignore that. That's what they want. And so you're moving along. But what will happen inevitably is things will happen along the way that crop up that either they weren't aware of, but you certainly, they weren't on your radar. And I think sometimes we can ignore those things as advisors if we're so focused on the end goal. Like, oh, well, we just have to deliver this plan, this exit, this whatever it is. And I think it's really easy to ignore. Things are popping up all over the place. Like that's just life, right? And I think it's really easy to get so focused on things that you miss those things. And to me, actually, those are my favorite things that come up with families because that's where all the richness lives. That's where the pause happens and the going deeper in conversations about meaning and purpose and why they're actually doing this. I find with families, sometimes they're so focused on the end result of where they're trying to go that they're not thinking about the quality of their relationships. They're not thinking about the depth of their relationships. They're not thinking about what their actual fundamental goal is. Like sometimes they'll talk about money being the goal, and it's rarely the money. It's usually all about family. And, you know, in just about every family I work with, if you pull everything away and get to the core of it, it's about family. Those are the conversations that I love to have, and really helping people get closer and more connected to their purpose and what's meaningful to them, because then everything else falls into line. Uh, and even when there's conflict,
Right.
you know, that's the other thing, like even getting them more connected to purpose and what their ultimate desires are will also help them manage through conflict, right? So it's
Right.
that to me is the real richness in working with families.
Now, Judy, going back to you use the word adversity,
Yeah.
and and when working with families and families thinking about strategic planning and being focused, how
Mhm.
how can they build that resilience to be able
Mhm.
to adapt as that adversity comes to be?
Yeah. Well, I think the tricky thing in working with families more than any other kind of consulting client is that adversity for one person is not adversity for another. And so you can't, it's not like this blanket thing that the family feels. Sometimes there might be things that are going on that they are struggling with, but often it's one person that's struggling with, like, we have a family right now where one member of the family, the whole process feels like adversity for this person. Like the whole, like having to have these conversations creates so much stress and difficulty for this person that just going into meetings is a challenge for them, right? Like they go, I'd rather be doing something else, right?
Right.
Anything else, really. And but for other family members, they embrace it. They go, I want to go in, I want to resolve these things, I want to get clear about where we're going and what our next phase of our lives and our existence as a business and as a family. I want to get clear about those things. And so I think that adversity has to be managed in a very delicate way. And, you know, there's time spent with individuals. Like sometimes we will spend more time with individuals in the system, which is one of the reasons why we always work in teams. So there might be some team members that are working with individuals, other team members that are attending to the entire system and the whole family. But that kind of building resilience really happens over time. And it's sometimes, I wouldn't say by accident, but they sort of just like we will point it out, like, look at the difference of where you were and where you are now in terms of, how you're managing through these things, how you're making decisions, how much clarity you have, etc. And they will say, oh, I didn't realize that. Because when you're in the process, you can get lost, right? I mean, just
Right.
like if you were somebody was coaching you, or you were in counseling or whatever it is that you're doing to help you get clear about your own life, sometimes you don't know the distance that you've traveled, right? And so it's the same thing when we work with families is sometimes they're not aware of all the things. So we are often pointing out things that have changed in the family. I was facilitating a family meeting, and in the first day there are 2 days of meetings, and the first day there were 8 people in the meeting in the family, and in the first day, probably 3 of them dominated the conversation, and we kept trying to bring other people in, but sometimes they're not comfortable because it's just not part of their family culture, right? So you get like 3 of the 8 who are dominating. Well, then by the next day, it's really balanced. And so when we point that out, and they don't realize that that has happened, right? Like they don't
Right.
realize that now everybody's talking and that everybody is engaged in the conversation, and it's a much more balanced conversation. They're not aware of it until you point it out. So that's sometimes how resilience gets built, is in those little tiny places that sometimes they're not even really aware of. And then they start to go, oh, right. So we can have a balanced conversation in our family, when their experience before was it's always the 3 people that are dominating the conversation. And for the rest of the family, that doesn't feel good to them, right? Like
Right.
if it is 3 of them. And so they do start to really feel better as it's more balanced.
Now, Judi, let's go back to the individuals that make up, the pieces of the
Yeah.
puzzle, and the work that's being done on the collective versus the individual. So
Yeah.
you use the example of, the person that's feeling like everything in the process is adversity. How does that person, or, as you work with them, how do they know that this is the right direction? If everything feels like adversity, and it just feels like an uphill challenge, where they don't just throw in the towel and say, this really isn't the right direction. It's not
Right.
feeling right. Where maybe everyone else is saying we're still going
Yeah.
in the right direction.
I think that, our job is to facilitate dialogue. It's not to direct them in any particular direction. It is our job to help them clarify that direction. So they are, at the end of it, they have a direction, but we're not pushing them in one direction or another. That's their choice. And I think for individuals that are going, I don't know, that's why individual work is so important. One of the things that I believe when we work with individuals, it's really understanding what is hard about this. One of the things we will ask them is, what would make this easier? So, is there something that we could do around the structure of the conversation, around the topics of conversation? Are there things that you could talk to your other family members that if you clarified some things with them, it would make it easier for you? Do you need to say no to some things? Do you need to exit some of the conversations and let other people come to agreement, and then you'll join after the agreement is made? Do you want to exit? Because sometimes people will say, I don't want to be a part of that conversation. It's
Right.
too stressful for me. And I'm actually okay if my voice is not in there, and I'm willing to live with what they decide. And so they can exit and then they can come back in. So it's not a all or nothing thing. They can exit for one conversation and come back in the next conversation. They can exit for part of a conversation. So, allowing, one of the things that I find with individuals, the moment you give them options and they know that they are choosing, rather than feeling like I have to be in there. I'm a family member. I have to be in there.
Right.
So if you give, if they start to feel like they have choice, and then they start to say, well, do I want to be in there? Not necessarily I have to be in there. Then they start to kind of really think about what's important to them. And what I find is the moment they start to feel like they have choice, most often they will choose to be in. Not always. Sometimes they will choose to be out because they don't, they're not comfortable with where things are going. And they don't want to be part of it. But a lot of times they will, once they start feeling like, oh, you mean I could exit? And for at least for this conversation. And if they feel that way, then they will say, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to participate in this.
And Judi, in some cases, I would think that this could be the first time that that person would be given that permission to feel the way that they're feeling and be okay with the way that they are, thinking about things. Because, in a lot of family systems, there's a lot of pressure on individuals that, maybe the pressure that they think keeps the family together, but it also could be the pressure that's pushing somebody away. So how have you seen that work really allow the individuals and the families to thrive?
Well, I think that, we pay a lot of attention to how the individuals, so we spend time with the individuals to understand how they're feeling, to understand where their lines and their boundaries are. Because to your point, one of the challenges in families is that often people don't actually know where their boundaries are because they've been pressured to get along, to go along. And sometimes people will go along to get along. Like they'll just be like, well, I don't want to cause conflict, so I'll just go along with this, even when inside they're disagreeing. And that to me is a recipe for disaster, because in the future, that will always come out. I never wanted to do this. I never agreed with this in the first place. I just went along with it because I felt like I had to, any number of things like that, right? Where they're just, but it will come out later. I guarantee you it always does. They will say no. And so one of the things that I think in working with families, we give a lot of, give individuals a lot of license to say no and allow that to work inside the family. And the more license people feel to say no, the more agency they have over their choices, the more they can find their yeses, the more they will move forward and say, yes, I want this. But they sometimes need to explore those no's. And which is why we do a lot of individual work while we're working with the family. And sometimes it's the first time that this kind of dynamic of family and individual is being managed together, because they're used to, like, it's not that family members don't listen to each other. They do, but you know what happens in your own family. Sometimes we listen for the things that we want to listen for, right? We hear the things that we want to hear. And sometimes when we hear something that we don't want to hear, we just either ignore it or we just say, I don't know what to do with that. So I'm going to pretend I didn't hear it. Right. Well, our job is to help them hear it. right? And to really hear all of the things. And
Well,
that time is really, to your original question around resilience, that's where resilience gets built. Because over time, they learn how to have these harder conversations with each other. They don't avoid the difficult things. They start to address them face to face. They start to go, okay, we have an experience of talking about hard things openly, and it was okay. Like we didn't fall apart and end up in a massive conflict. It was okay. We did
right.
it. Right?
Yes. And so,
And
Judi,
that's,
Judi, the stakes are high in family enterprises,
yeah,
and we mentioned the pressure that's whether it's the pressure they feel is holding them together. I want to go back to your comment of pretending that I didn't hear that, because
yeah.
oftentimes that much too often that is the case. And how how do families, it's really an individual thing, is building the skill set to be able to hear those and to deal with them. How do families begin to do that? Whether or not they're working with somebody such as yourself and your team, or they're just being aware of the fact that they're doing that
Mm,
and pretending.
yeah. So I mean, it's exactly the same thing that happens with advisors. Sometimes advisors want to ignore things that they hear because they don't know how to deal with it. And often what I find, it's not out of malicious intent by family members. They're not ignoring things because they think, oh, I don't care about you.
Right.
So I'm going to ignore what you just said. They just don't know. Either they've heard it a whole bunch of times and they're tired of hearing it and it's never changing, and instead of saying, why, like you say this all the time, I don't understand it. I don't understand the way you think. What family members typically do is they'll just ignore something like that. Well, what we do is, first of all, we slow everything down and we'll stop them and say, okay, let's talk about that. So we'll ask questions that, one of the challenges in families is that people speak shorthand to each other. So, when you've been with people your whole life, in your head, when they're talking to you, you are um, you are filtering the information through your 30, 40, 50 years of experience with that person. And so
Right.
what you're doing is you're saying, I know what they think, I know how they think, I know what they meant by what they just said. So curiosity is not present in a lot of families because they think they already understand, because they've been working with either personally or professionally with this person for so many years and had so much experience with them that they're not curious anymore. They don't go, well, what do you mean by that? And so one of the things that we do is we get really curious, and then they realize, oh, and sometimes we'll say, what do you think they meant by that? And then they'll say, well, I think they meant this. And the other person will say, well, actually, that's not what I meant. So
Right.
one of the things that, just from a skill building, I think that one of the most important skills that families need to learn how to do is be curious and check out a lot of the assumptions that they're making. So you said this, did you mean X versus Y? Like really check it out. Did this information mean that? When you said that, whatever you wanted to do this, did that mean forever, or did that mean just for right now? Or like, what does it actually mean? And being curious and questioning and really understanding, I think, is a skill that families really need to learn. Often what I say to family members is, I'll say, pretend you've never met this person. You probably would be really curious about them. And you wouldn't assume that you know what they meant when they said that to you.
Right.
And I think that's a really important thing, is really learning how to be curious with one another again after they've been together for so many years, right? I mean, it happens in couples that have been together, they're not curious with each other. And often that's when things go off the rails.
Right. So bringing back to the fact that these are relationships and they do need to be worked
Yeah.
on. And
Yeah.
so let's talk about the transformation from, it's a cultural transformation within the family to go from I've known you for decades, and I assume a lot of things and fill in the blanks, to
Mm-hmm.
we've now transformed to that curious culture, and we're working on those relationships. What sort of transformations, as you've worked with people, have you seen over time? Because this isn't an instant thing. This is an over
No,
time.
it takes time. It's actually a beautiful thing to watch. That sounds kind of corny, but it's why I do this work. It's really gratifying to watch relationships change, to watch people that have been in long-standing conflict to actually be able to laugh again with one another, to be open to one another. And these are family members that at the core, they never stop loving each other. They love each other, but there's things that have gone on that have just gotten in the way of their relationships, but you can see the love. And so when you peel away some of these things and they do learn to be curious again, it is transformational, and it becomes this really beautiful thing. And I worked with a family down in the States that there were three brothers, and they ended up through the process. The two of the brothers, well, they were all in conflict with one another. And over the course of working with them, one of the things that happened was one of the brothers said, I just want to get bought out. And they were always resistant to him leaving because they were afraid that that was the beginning of the end of their relationship, that if he left, that their relationship would be fractured, because the relationship was already fractured. So it was kind of hanging on by a thread. And so one of the things that I said to them is, what could happen, I can't guarantee this, but what could happen is when he's able to leave and he exits, he may be able to come back. And so it took time, but over time he exited the business. And I got an email from one of the brothers, and he said, I don't even know how to thank you for this. This is like, he said, I never thought this could happen in my lifetime. I have my brother back. And he comes and he spends time with our family. He is at all of the holidays. He never used to come to any of the holidays. He used to spend all his time away from the family, and it completely transformed their family. And he was just so happy. And it was just, one of those emails when you just go, that is just so gratifying to hear that they have their family back now.
Right.
But sometimes it's paradoxical, right? You think, well, if you exit, that means you're just going to go away, but it actually had him feel free to come back. And so, anyway, so you
And
just never know how these things are going to end up, right?
and so what I'm sensing is there's a lot of fear that is holding back these decisions.
Yeah. Families are existing. I mean, and often it's fear around the relationship, right? I
Right.
mean, look, these families are so smart around building their businesses. Some of them are so incredibly successful. And you just go, oh my gosh, sometimes when I'm working with these families, I'm thinking, how did they get to be so smart? Like, they've just built these massive empires. But if you look at what is so important to them, and that the business is important to them, they love it, they find it really interesting, they love the challenge of the growth, like they love all that stuff. But they also really love their families, and they're very tentative around their families, and they are really wanting it to work well with their families. I'm working with an entrepreneur right now, and his style, like if you just met this person, you would think he doesn't really care about his family, right? But what I know is that he is desperate for them to acknowledge him, to care about him. Like they're everything to him. But if you look at the external behavior, you wouldn't initially think that. Right. And so the family is so important to most of these family enterprise entrepreneurs. So important.
Now, Judi, you used a couple terms that I want to go back to. When you told the story of the brothers that were in business together, there's what I'm sensing is there's a melding of the roles. I'm a business partner and I'm a brother. And can you talk about a little bit how some of that confusion sets in, or where we're around the dinner table as a family, but we see each other not as family members, but as what we see each other during the day?
Well, it's a hard thing in families when you are working together, you're owning together, and you're family members, right? They get confused as to which conversation and what hat I'm wearing and who I am in this conversation. Am I the business owner? Or am I the business owner? Am I the business operator, or am I your brother right now? And so that gets very confusing for families. And so we do think that by being deliberate about environments that we have, that families are meeting in. So for instance, you wouldn't generally have a business operations meeting sitting around the dining room table. You would typically do that in a business, right? And so you would do it around the boardroom table. You might have an ownership meeting in the boardroom, but you also might have that somewhere else. You might have that in a different environment. And so really being deliberate around where they're sitting when they're having these conversations, who's in the room when they're having these conversations, and what's on the agenda. Excuse me. And not mixing the agendas, but trying to really change the agendas, right?
Right. And that goes back. It makes me think of a family member I was having a conversation with, and this was a brother-led business now, and they were bringing the third generation in, and he was talking about the conversations that he was having with his nephew, and I said, have you thought about, instead of on the shop floor, maybe taking him for lunch? And you've then gone from being his boss to being his uncle again. And so in those situations, Judi, you said, being deliberate about the environment. Is there anything as far as structure goes? I think about, as you said, the agenda and the environment, but things that families can become a little bit more intentional about continuing to cultivate those relationships.
Well, I think, Corey, if you are, so that example that you just used, like go and take him for lunch and be his uncle, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to understand, like, he's not really performing very well, do I need to make this a performance conversation, or do I need to make this a personal conversation to say, look, how are you doing? Is this a job? Like, do you want to be working here? How are you doing overall? That's an uncle conversation. That's not and to be really candid about, I'm not your boss right now. I'm not the owner of this business, or whoever he is, I am your uncle, and I want you to just think about that when I'm talking to you. And so asking questions that are really more of a personal nature, and then also creating an environment where whoever this person is reporting to, that it isn't necessarily the same person, right? Like getting, like if it's a big enough business, having your nephew report into somebody that isn't family is going to make it a lot better, because they can have a performance conversation a lot easier, and it doesn't get confusing, right?
Right.
Because when you're the uncle and the boss, it can be a confusing conversation for somebody when you're doing when you're having a performance conversation, because you're going in your head, you're saying, this is my uncle. And even things like, I'm disappointing them, I don't want to disappoint them. What if my dad finds out and he's going to be upset with me, etc. So all these things where a family member might not be able to be really open. And
Right.
so, encouraging structures that work. So yes, making sure you're having the right conversations with the right people in the right place at the right time, but it's also having other structures like making sure that family members aren't reporting into family members, and sometimes it's not possible. We have a client right now where there's so at an ownership level, the family members are equal, but at a business level, one reports into the other. It does not, it's not great, because they have a really hard time separating that. Now, in our facilitation, we will say to them, this is an ownership conversation, so you're all equal right now.
Right.
And this is a business conversation, and now you report into this person. But that's where they get really confused. And so it's not perfect. There's nothing, there's no way that we can kind of fix that, but it's helping them understand where the lines are around the business and then the ownership conversations, right? And then they're also obviously siblings.
Right.
And so you have that whole dynamic, right? And one's older than the other. I mean, that's the other interesting dynamic with families, is that you have embedded hierarchies, even though a sibling group by nature is their equal, right? So they're peers, but birth order creates an unequal structure that people start going, well, I'm the older one, so I get to decide more, which has nothing to do with being older, right?
Right.
Because we have lots of clients where the youngest is actually, the decision maker. So there isn't any, hierarchy is just a construct in a family, right? Even with parents and children. Like I was working with a family and I said, in the family system, you're all equal. There's no hierarchy. And the dad said, forget about that. There is a hierarchy, right? He's like, I have a stronger voice than my kids. But when we boiled it down and I said, why? He said it was really about the ownership that he had a stronger voice around. So that's how he kept, because he did. He was in the fourth generation. He owned, a ton more of the operations than his children did. So he did have a greater vote in the system, but he had married that with the family system. And then there's also this idea with parents and children that as a parent, I get a stronger voice. But when everybody's adults, like at what point does that go away? When are
Right.
we having adult to adult conversations? Or do you always have a stronger voice as a parent for the rest of your lives? Right. And so, but it's usually because they have created, these leaders have created the wealth in many instances, not always, but they've often created the wealth. And so in their minds, they go, well, therefore I have a stronger voice, right? But they think that it's because they're a parent.
Right.
And it's not.
Yes. And, as you mentioned, the adult to adult conversations,
Mm-hmm.
We have in transactional analysis, which is talking about the parent, adult, and child, it's often referred in the parent to child and bringing that. But what about when it comes to cousins? We're raised together, we see each other at holidays, but we're in different households, and now we're supposed to have these conversations as adults. How does that culture change, or how is that different from just a nuclear family?
I think what happens, so the first mistake that I see that families make is they assume that if you grow up in the same household, you all think the same, you all value the same things, you're all the same, which we know that's not the case. I have 7 siblings. Everybody thinks very differently. People have similar values, but they're not the same, right? Like they're just not the same. And so we're individuals. So I think that gets confusing for families. And then when you go into branches, because in a branch, it's the result of siblings. So those siblings were similar but different. And then they marry someone that brings a whole new culture, and then they have children. So sometimes the branches are so diverse, like night and day different. Sometimes they're just a little bit different, but some of them are completely different. Like you go, I can't even believe that's the same family, right? And so when you're trying to work across the cousin groups, it is like negotiating. I mean, there's a bond because there is a family connection. And sometimes families, like those cousins, have spent a lot of time together growing up. And for others, so they know them, they know who they are, and they know how they think, but they may not feel connected to them, because those cousins may have gone off and done very different things in their lives. And, we have families where some of the cousins are like really accomplished, and the other ones are still living at home, right? And they're both in their 20s, but some of them have been off and they're super successful, and others have been, barely kind of got their careers off the ground. So it's the same thing as working within a family. It's just spending more time finding those places where they are connected, where, what they want, where they want to go. So it's the same work, because really you're trying to find alignment across the cousin group. It's just sometimes a lot more work. Some families are pretty aligned. Like we had a client that the 3rd generation of cousins, I think there was like 18 of them, was actually remarkable how aligned they were. And I would say that it was because the 2nd generation was so aligned. Right. So there was so much alignment and kind of connection at the 2nd generation level that it really showed in the 3rd generation. But every family is so unique. This is why I think sometimes people will come in and they'll say, well, can you just give me the best practice? And I'm like, there is no best practice, right? There really isn't. I mean, there are things that we would say this is going to be helpful.
Right.
And it would be helpful if you did these certain things. But families are so uniquely different that you just, everything's kind of this custom way of managing through it. So
there's no flow chart that if this, then that.
I wish. I wish. You just do, here's like the 12-step process, right? Just
Yes.
follow this, you'll be good, right?
Yes. Yes. Judy, as
Yeah.
we near the end of our conversation, there's a few questions that I ask each of our guests.
Yeah.
Are you ready for the top ones?
Yeah.
All right. What is one strategy that you believe is the most essential for building a successful family enterprise?
Um, I would say transparency. I think that if family members and the family as a whole can agree, and this usually starts with the senior generation, that if they can start from this fundamental premise of transparency, a lot of things can get accomplished. But the more that they don't want to be transparent, the harder it is to build something for the future that actually works.
Right.
So I'm a big proponent of transparency, and it's not easy.
I can imagine. And what is the most common challenge that you see family enterprises encountering when it comes to wealth transition and generational continuity?
I think the well, there's a few of them. So I think that the courage to address hard stuff, I think that's a big challenge. I think fundamentally in families, people are afraid might be too strong a word. They're nervous. They're worried about making things worse. I just I just had a patriarch say to me, please don't make this worse. Right. Like, we're hiring you to make this better. Please don't make it worse. And so, and sometimes it's at that law of cure. Sometimes it does get worse before it gets better. However, we never go in thinking we're going to make it worse. Right. So I think that the courage to address things is a big challenge. The other thing that I think is a big challenge is the willingness to include the rising generation. I think that so for these really strong patriarchs, what I often say to them is what got you here won't get you there. Because they think that if I've made all the decisions to date, so I'm just going to make all the decisions into the future. And I'm going to design this for like 3 generations from now. And I'm like, but you're not going to have people that want to engage. And then they're perplexed why nobody wants to be involved. Right. I'm like, because they weren't part of it.
Right.
So this willingness to include and to listen and to be open to doing something different than what you thought. And it's very hard for highly successful people because they will say things like, but they don't know what they don't know. I know how it's going to work, right? Like I've done it and I know how to make this thing successful. So they should just listen to me. And I'm like, but they need a voice in this. So it's this really big dilemma. And so I think that's a big challenge. And then I would say the other thing is the openness to evolve. Sometimes what I find with senior generation members is they're so dug into how it needs to look that they're not open to it being different. And in the differences is where we really find a new place for a family to evolve into and finding a new level of resilience and change, et cetera. So
Right. And that nicely ties into the fact, as you said at the beginning, is the so much focus on planning and excluding everything else.
yeah.
And I love that. Judi, in your experience, what would you say are the top 3 qualities that successful family enterprise leaders possess? And this might be leaders in the now generation, the rising gen, but just those qualities of leadership.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably the things that I just talked about, it's that openness to change, the willingness to bring other voices in, the courage to address things, the the willingness to exist in the unknown. That is not a comfortable place for a lot of these senior members. They don't play well in the unknown. Like they're so used to being the decision makers and the I have to figure this out. They're the fixers. They are the ones that say the buck stops with me, and so I have to figure this out. And that's really hard. That is really hard for them to say, okay, maybe it's not going to be me. Maybe it's going to be somebody else.
Right. Before we conclude our discussion today, I'd like to highlight where our listeners can engage in more conversations that you're having. Would you provide us with where?
Yeah, so our website is trella.ca. And so that's our website. So I would encourage people to go there. I also, if listeners are advisors, you and I were talking before about the Purposeful Planning Institute, which is the purposefulplanninginstitute.com. I'm a big believer. Families need a space for them to talk to other families that's private, that is advisor free, that is just for them. So I'm a big believer in that. So go to places like Family Enterprise Canada, get in peer groups, be in an environment where you can talk to other family members. And then I also believe that advisors need their private space to talk to other advisors, to talk about the challenges of working with families, because it is challenging. And so places like the Purposeful Planning Institute or Family Enterprise Canada, any of these organizations that really help with these things, I think that those organizations are fantastic. So
perfect. And I wanted to make sure that we covered everything today. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience that we didn't get a chance to touch on?
I don't think so. I think I've enjoyed this conversation. I think it's great that you're doing this, Corey. And helping the people that are listening. Podcasts are so popular now, but helping people that are listening to find resources and, learn things that will help them think through what they want to do. So anyway, I just think it's been a good conversation. I've enjoyed it. So
I have as well, Judi, and thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. It was definitely an insightful and valuable conversation, and I'm grateful for your contribution to our show in this episode.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. As we wrap up this episode, we invite you to reflect on the relationship truths Judi has revealed from her rich experience advising multi-generational family enterprises. Whether you're part of a family business or provide consulting to them, Judi's wisdom sheds insight on complex dynamics that can take patience to transform. Throughout our discussion, Judi offered several insightful takeaways to put into action. Make room for open, curious dialogue between family members, even when conversations get uncomfortable. Clearly establish family roles versus business roles to reduce confusion about which hat someone is wearing. Implement structures and protocols around information sharing and decision making as more households take ownership stake. And don't be afraid to lean on wider communities or specialists like Judi, who can lend an outside perspective when alignment remains elusive internally. For those seeking additional guidance on themes covered today, Judi and her team at Trella Advisory Group have extensive experience guiding families through challenges big and small. Please reach out if you have specific questions, and we've included Judi's contact information in the show notes. Thank you for joining me, Corey Gagnon, your host of Legacy Builders Podcast. It's my personal passion to explore with you these topics related to family wealth. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred podcast platform. And don't forget to share this episode with family, friends, and colleagues who you care about. If you'd like to help support this show, you can do so by leaving a rating and review. If If you have any questions about anything shared on today's episode, or have topics you'd like us to dive deeper into in future episodes, please let us know by emailing beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com. That's beaconfamilyoffice@assante.com. Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises is brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante. Are you worried about losing what you've created and seeking ways to transition your wealth across generations? Beacon Family Office at Asante supports our clients transition their wealth while maintaining relationships. If you'd like to access more content we've created, you can visit us at beaconfamilyoffice.com or for more details on our services and book an initial call. Thanks again for listening, and until next episode, stay intentional about building your legacy. This program was prepared by Corey Gagnon, who is a senior wealth advisor with Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. This is not an official program of Asante Financial Management, and the statements and opinions expressed during this podcast are not necessarily those of Asante Financial Management. This show is intended for general information only and may not apply to all listeners or investors. Please obtain professional financial advice or contact us at beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com or visit beaconfamilyoffice.com to discuss your particular circumstances prior to acting on the information presented.